Hello, everyone. It's been a while since I've done a video recording, and I haven't even been around much lately, what with my couple of weeks in Norway. And that, in fact, is what this video lesson was inspired by. Now, Norway has some really big mountains, which is why I wanted to go. But that means difficult trails. And forget the gentle switchbacks that I encountered in the Pacific Northwest last year. That was so easy. These trails, so like New England trails in this sense, because New England trails tend to just go straight up, forget switchbacks. And these trails in Norway, for the most part, went straight up too. But unlike most New England trails, some exceptions, the terrain that went up was steep and rocky and sometimes near cliff-like. It was a challenge. Now I'm an experienced hiker, and with caution, I was able to handle it all. But then one day, I was in the midst of this wonderful hike, and I'm hiking over these hills and bridges, and it was a beautiful day. And then I reached the bottom of the ridge to the summit that I was aiming for. And I hike up over this small little hill, and I look up, there's the ridge in front of me and the face of the ridge. And from where I stood, it looked like the trail went up, must go up, or it looked like this face of the ridge was a near 90-degree angle up rocks and scree to the ridge above. And I could see a little bit of the trail at the bottom on the left, but after that, it was just this wall of rocks. And like, I can't climb up that. So here is what I saw when I approached the ridge. Actually, in this video, it doesn't look nearly as intimidating as it looked, or certainly felt at the time as I stood at the bottom of it. But I was a little bit, I saw it and I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure I can do that. And I'm an experienced hiker, but hiking solo, as I often do, I am pretty cautious, and I have no need to be a hero. I'm always willing to turn back if something is just too difficult or too much for my energy at that moment, or if it's going to get dark. I'm more about, about the journey. It's the hiking, and the summit is nice, but it's nice to reach that destination, but I don't have to. I'm willing to turn back, and I was entirely prepared to do so if I needed with this trail. But I thought, well, let me try it out, see what it's like. So up I went. And the interesting thing was, as I ascended, I realized that the trail, although it certainly was not easy, it was not nearly as bad and steep and difficult and as plain scary as it had looked from when I stood at the bottom of it. Granted, as I got to the beginning of it, it was like actually easier than some of the other trails I had done. Steep, no question, but there was a small little kind of narrow path through the steepness. And granted, towards the top, I did have to find my way over quite a steep wall of rocks, and it got a little dicey, but it was doable, and I managed it. So I'm sharing this story with you, one, because my head is still in Norway to a bit, but mostly to illustrate how things always aren't as they first appear. How we perceive things can depend on so many variables. And in the case of this trail going up to the ridge, it was my head-on perspective from the bottom that made it look more difficult than it actually was to do. I was still a bit nervous heading up it, but once I was heading down, my perspective changed yet again, because by then I knew what the trail was like, and I'd already done it. And I knew I could handle it. So my perspective changed going up, and then going down. It's like, I know I can do this. So my perspective changed again. I was less nervous about it. So perspective is everything. Now I'm going to show you an image that is probably one you've seen before. Try to share just that window. Hopefully you can. Yeah, I think you can probably see that. Oops, that's not the one. Getting ahead of myself here. So this is a classic. It's not opening big, but that's okay. There we go. This is a classic image that you've probably seen about, like, what do you see? Like, different people see different things, right? Is it two people's faces, or is it a vase in the middle? Now, in this example, it shows it in different ways so that it kind of gives a different perspective on how you might view it. But it's the same thing each time. Like the first one, I definitely see the two people's heads. In the middle one, I kind of see the heads, I kind of see the vase. But in the last one, when it kind of connects at the top, it definitely looks like a vase or like more like maybe a chalice. But really, it's the same thing. And you've probably all, well, you might not, some of you might remember like the whole thing there's this thing on social media about, is it a blue dress or is it a gold dress? And it was like 8 years ago now, I just looked it up and it was kind of silly, but, oh, so these were kind of, some people would, there was this image of a dress and some people would see it as blue, some people would see it as gold. This image here, this was manipulated to show it as each, but, um, and I guess in the case of that, it was because of the lighting and how the lighting was, like it was kind of coming in from one side. So one side it looked one way, one side it looked another. But also we all kind of, our brains work differently, our eyes work differently, we all see things differently. There was this tablecloth in a cottage where my family used to stay when I was a kid on Soame Sound. And it had this kind of bluish greenish tablecloth. And my mom and I would always get into this thing of, is it blue or is it green? And honestly, I can't remember which color I thought it was. It was somewhere in between, but we just had little different definitions there. And in fact, color is another thing that can look very different depending on your own eyes and depending on context. So here's an example of how the context can change what a color looks like. So on the left, those two inner small rectangles are the same color purple, even though the purple inner rectangle on the right looks so much lighter, but it's just because of the context. And on the left, the inner rectangle, red rectangle, looks much darker to me than the one on the right, but that's surrounded by green. But again, it's just because of the context. And I know when I was painting my bedroom, it's really dark. So I had such a hard time picking out a color because it just looked so different in the dark and the light. And I'd be taking paint samples out of the store into the light and then taking them in a dark place. And so, so context matters to how we see things. Whoops, let me try to get out of here. And all right, I don't think you should be seeing my screen anymore. So even our brains can perceive things differently. So why is this? Like, why there's these things in the world that, like I'm looking outside, I see trees. Trees are trees, right? We think of what's around us in the world as something solid. So how can we interpret these kind of solid things in so many different ways? And not only might different people have different perspective, one person might see something differently than another person, but even our own perspectives on things aren't always the same. For example, that ridge I hiked up. So many things can influence how we interpret the world around us. So culture is a big one, our cultural background, how we grew up, what we learned from our parents, what we learned from our communities, and the culture around us. Past experience can very much affect how we see things, our own personal interest, history, and what has happened to us in the past. If certain things have happened happen a certain way in the past, you got treated as a certain way by a certain person, you might expect more of that treatment from other people moving forward. Your emotional state, feelings can color our perception to a big deal and up to a great deal. And a funny example I have about this is when I'm running or cross-country skiing, sometimes it's just a really small amount of grade, so I don't necessarily notice I'm going up or down when I actually am. And I remember times when I've been running and I just get all grumpy and like, this person's awful and that's so annoying, blah, 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 blah. And this are the thoughts going through my head. And then I look around, I was like, oh, I'm running up just a little bit, but I'm running up. And then later remember this one spot coming down when I used to do this quad lake run. It's like 18 miles. I haven't done that for ages, but coming down your little long pond, it started like that for a while. It eventually became a more downhill, but at first it was just a very gentle downhill. And I'd be thinking, oh, that's wonderful. This is wonderful. And it was all because of my physical exertion and my energy and my state of mind at the time that I was like, oh, I was suffering a little bit when I was going uphill. So I was having these negative thoughts and having a negative outlook on the things around me versus going downhill and everything around me was wonderful. And a similar story I had recently on a podcast, a woman who was about sleep. And this woman recorded herself. She had a new baby, and she recorded herself in the middle of the night when had not got a regular night's sleep in a while, and the world was this terrible place, and the way everything she was talking. And a few days later, there's a recording of her when after she had slept, and everything in the world was wonderful. So our own emotional state at any given time can influence how we see things. And finally, others can influence how we see things too. Peer pressure and group dynamics and how people around us see things can also influence sometimes how we do. So I just want to touch on one other aspect of perception today. And this is kind of a larger view on the way we can perceive the world and two kind of modes. So psychologists have come up with these terms of lantern mode versus spotlight mode. So for lantern mode, think of the way a lantern lights up everything around it within its reach in all directions. Now, this is typically how kids perceive the world. They're taking in everything all around them all the time, like a lantern. Instead of singling out one particular aspect of experience to highlight, their minds cast a diffuse radiance on everything they see. Because children have fewer preconceptions about what will turn out to be interesting or important, they just take it all in because anything around them could potentially be interesting. Versus a spotlight, if you think about a spotlight, it lights up only one thing at a time. And this is the way adults tend to perceive the world in a spotlight. Perceiving things with great focus, just focusing on whatever is preoccupying them at the time. And spotlight consciousness is the mode we've trained ourselves to turn on when it's time to get work done. It's like, oh, I got to do this task, so I'm going to focus just on that. It's the kind of consciousness that's promoted both in schools and later in our workplaces. And it has its uses, this spotlight mode. It allows us to tick through our to-do list in an efficient and directed manner. But it does come at a cost because all of the other possibilities present out there in the world, even the other way of maybe accomplishing our task beside the single way we've selected, all these other things essentially become invisible to us because we're just spotlighting this one narrow thing. So unfortunately, this spotlight mode that we're all essentially trained for, it doesn't allow us the space for flexible, open-minded, indeterminate, and incidental kind of thinking, the kind of thinking that generates creative ideas and that lets us appreciate all that we are surrounded by, and that generates awe. So there are a few ways we can try to perceive the world through more of a lantern mode instead of always being in spotlight mode. So one that is, of course, in my mind right now is travel. So right when everything is new, you can't help just looking in all directions at once and trying to take it all in, because kind of like a kid, everything is new to a kid, a small child, right? So they're taking it all in. When you're in a new place, it's all new. So you're kind of just taking it all in and less just focused on one thing. And think about that versus when you're in your own hometown and you have some place to be and you're just focused on getting there. Also, you can seek out experiences of awe. I've talked about the power of awe in, I think, multiple previous lessons. And children are frequently in a state of awe because, as I was just saying, so much of the world, it's all so new. So it all seems amazing and wondrous to them because it's all new things. So try to look at the world with a freshness, and you might be able to appreciate it in new ways, and it will help you kind of look at more about you in all directions. And finally, you can practice mindfulness, and I don't like how that word has become sort of a thing lately and somewhat overused, but it's really just about paying attention. Instead of the intense focus on whatever you have to do or where you need to be. And, always thinking ahead, right? Our brains, we're always thinking about the next thing. So instead, just even give yourself 10 seconds to just pause, maybe the length of a breath or two, and have an awareness of the present moment and give yourself the moment to look around, to see what's around you, to hear what's around you, maybe smell what's around you if you're outside and things smell good. And just have that really short moment of the present and kind of that lantern look at the world and welcoming in any new information that you might be presented with. So the important takeaway from this is that the world is not as solid as a place as we like to think. At least how we see it is not that solid. And actually, well, I won't get into physics, but actually in reality, it's not as solid as we like to think either, which this becomes fascinating to me, but I won't go down that road. But the world is only as we perceive it to be in our own heads. And that's going to be very different between different people, and even different for ourselves as individuals, varying at different points in our lives or even on our mood on a given day. So remember that when someone has a different perspective from you, they are going to. No one has the same perspective and on everything. And there's so many factors that go into that. So their perspective in their heads makes a lot of sense to them because of the lives they've lived, the culture they've grown up with, and where they are at that moment. And so there's some things in life that aren't necessarily right or wrong, but it's just how we each see them as individuals. So I encourage you to think critically about your own perceptions in daily life and try to remember the importance of considering all the different perspectives out there and respecting them all. That is all for today. I hope you have a great week. I'll see you next time.